Hi everyone. Recently you may have seen me wearing this uniform at the Capel Military Show in the United Kingdom, where I went to hang out with Francis Pullum and Will Cares, authors of T-34 Shock, Soviet Legend and Pictures, which is a unique and very useful book on the T-34 and T-34-85 tanks. Now the reason I went there was because they have access to a fully functional T-34-85 tank to play with. And if you've seen the photos and clips from the show already, or if you've attended the show, then you probably know that I was a part of the crew for that show. Now, obviously, we couldn't take all of the audience into the tank with us during the presentation because there's simply not that much room, but fortunately for you, I was wearing a wire the whole time. So through this action camera, you will be able to see inside the T-34-85 tank. Now, the unique thing about this video is that while we were in the tank, it was not just a static presentation with the tank driving around in a circle and the commander poking his head out of the turret and looking dashing. The tank was fully crewed. We had 5 or sometimes even 6 people inside there. And when the gunnery demonstrations began, we did have to shut the hatches. So we used the opportunity to go through a couple of drills or motions that a tank crew would have in real life. So I did have a chance to experience the gunner, commander, and radio operator stations. And while I didn't get to act as the loader, you will also see a video of the loader in this video. So I'm going to start with my impressions of the radio operator. As you can see, getting into the tank is easier through the turret hatch. Normally, the radio operator would get through the front, the driver's hatch, but we already had Frankie break his phone while trying to get in through that, so I wasn't going to risk it. Yeah, so I call him the radio operator. On the original T-34 tank, this was the radio operator and hull gunner. On the T-34-85, with the radio moved into the turret, all the hull gunner has to do, well, is now fire the gun. Normally this would be a DTM, modernized DC machine gun mount. You would have an optical scope, but in this current tank there is only a little hole for the radio operator / hull gunner to look through. I took advantage of this opportunity to observe Alex, our driver, and you can see him driving around. It's honestly not that interesting to just watch him since you can't really see out of the hatch. But I left in some footage just so you can see that, yes, you can in fact drive a T-34 around without using a mallet or a hammer or some kind of mystic device to shift the gears or turn the tank. Electrics on?
Yeah, please.
On?
Yeah, do you want me to call me? Yes, please. Just let us know.
But they put a windscreen system in as well. So they pull down on the lever, pulls up the windscreen, and then
in terms of crew comfort, this was actually not the worst position to be in. The driver had plenty of room next to me to move around. Since I didn't really have much to do, I was just kind of sitting there, reclining backwards since the back of my seat was broken. But yeah, in terms of impressions, it's not that bad. Fortunately, the worst part about this position is that, A, you can't see anything.
That's the hull gunner's window into the outside world.
And it is quite disorienting. Presumably, if the driver's hatch was closed during the battle, I would be almost completely blind. Since this was not really a battle situation, it was fine.
Right, okay, can you hit the power?
Yep. Electrics off. The next position we're going to talk about is the commander. It's fairly easy, actually, to stand on that seat and look around, turn my body around, even as the tank is moving around and lurching around. So, not that bad to observe with the turret being open. Now, when the gunnery started, we closed the hatches and got down into the turret. And that's the interesting part. That's where I could actually see how the commander would operate button down. And I did take some footage inside the tank, and you get to hear it in my narration from that moment right now. I mean, what I wanted to do is get a bit of footage down here.
Try standing instead of sitting as well. See if that makes the position any easier, especially when fighting.
Oh, I can do that. Alright, so if I fold my seat back, it's actually...
Because obviously this comes down.
Oh yeah.
And that seat gets in the way, so I reckon you're looking over my shoulder, basically.
Yeah, I'm standing pretty comfortably right now. My eyes are exactly level with the periscopes up here.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can close the hatch over myself, and I think it'll be fine. Yeah, so it wouldn't be the worst place to sit. Alright, so there's this little perch below the gunner's seat here.
Well, that's got to be what it was for, isn't it?
And if I stand on that, with the hatch closed, my eyes are perfectly on the level of the rotating periscope in the commander's cupola. So we reckon that's how the commander would fight when they were buttoned down.
How hard do you find it to transition between that periscope, the swiveling one, and the fixed ones?
Yeah,
How hard do you find that transition as a commander? Because this is interesting for target finding.
Oh yeah. All right, let's
Drop the head again.
let's do that. Drop the periscope. Look at this one. Rotate.
And now switch to one of the
And now
vision
switch.
spots. Easy, isn't it?
So the average Soviet tanker would have been 170 centimeters tall and 80 kilograms in weight. You Americans can convert that into your imperial measurements yourselves. I am a little bit taller than that and a little bit lighter than that. So for me, actually, the commander's seat, all the instruments were on the correct eye level. It wasn't difficult to observe through either the commander's cupola slots or the rotating periscope, and you can actually see that the periscope conveniently folds up, so I could get in and out of the turret problem. So one of the things that we found out is that with the recoil guard folded down, the commander can't actually deploy his seat, because then the guard would hit it when the gun elevates. So there is a perch behind the gunner's seat that you can stand on, and it's a pretty comfortable position. We theorized that this is how the commander would have fought. Rather than sitting down, he would be standing on this perch behind the gunner. Now, the gunner and the commander do seem to be in quite cozy proximity. That's an artifact of the GoPro, but it's not a roomy tank. It is fairly crowded in there, but in there with four other guys that I only met that day, and it wasn't awkward. So make whatever judgment you want from that. Like I said, the loader station I didn't get a chance to work in, but here's one of the reenactors showing us how the loader would be loading the gun. He's taking the ammunition from the side of the turret. Normally you would use the ammunition in the back of the turret first, especially since you had special folding shelves there where the next round of ammunition would roll towards you as you expended them. Fortunately, we did not have a chance to record, quote-unquote, loading the gun from that angle.
But then you put it on there and it's almost perfectly lined up, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you just hoink it in. I reckon it would fit in that hole. Oh, I wondered that once. Yeah.
The next station is the gunner's station, and as you can see here, the gunner has two controls in front of him. There is one wheel to rotate the turret. That is the same wheel for the electric traverse and the manual traverse. If you want to operate the electric traverse, just pull the handle out and then snap it into a slot that's there. You can actually, you've seen Frankie operate the electric traverse while I was in the commander station. The turret rotates very, very quickly. It's very quick to get on target, and then the fine aiming would be done using the manual traverse. And my second hand is on the elevation flywheel. The elevation flywheel, don't really get to use it that much in this demonstration, but that's what the trigger is. So later when I fire the gun, you can see the electric trigger, and you can also see the electrically activated trigger on the side of the gun. If the electric mechanism fails, or if the electrics of the tank aren't running, I can actually just yank on that cable and fire the gun manually. So during a reenactment, the gunner actually has a fairly important job. You need to keep the turret on center, because since the turret lock wasn't engaged, the T-34-85 tank, when it makes a sudden turn, the turret has inertia, so it's still going to turn on its own power. There's actually a clutch in the traverse mechanism flywheel that makes sure that the teeth of the gear aren't destroyed when the turret moves on its own, like when the barrel hits a tree or something, or when a tank lurches like that. But that means that the gunner has to very carefully watch the traverse indicator during a reenactment and make sure that the gun is pointing where it's supposed to be pointing. You do see us play around with the turret and give the audience a bit of a show when the tank isn't moving and when it's safe to do so. So the gunner of a T-34-85 tank has two primary vision devices, not counting the pistol port and vision slit in the side. Your primary vision device is the 4x magnification scope. Interestingly enough, I found it very difficult to navigate through the scope, so even though I had already driven around that closed course in the commander's seat and I had a pretty good idea of what the circuit looks like and what the surroundings look like, it was very difficult to actually figure out where I am by looking through the scope. Thankfully, there's also a Mark IV periscope that you can look through. And this is a rotating periscope, and it is a godsend because I can tell you it's very disorienting to sit in a vehicle that's kind of driving around and lurching around probably close to an hour or hour and a half and have absolutely no idea where you are. And that periscope was very useful. Now, if you're a Panther gunner, you don't have a periscope like that, and you're kind of stuck. The only way you can interact with or perceive the outside world is through your magnified gun scope, which, like I said, is very, very difficult to actually figure out where you are. Small note on the gun sight, the brow pad is actually adjustable. So if you're left eye dominant or right eye dominant, you can set it up so you can watch through whichever eye you want. And even while wearing the goggles and wearing my glasses, the brow pad actually gave enough of a space for me to comfortably get in there and look through the gun sight without bumping anything. Now, of course, the most important job of the tank gunner is firing the tank gun, and I was lucky enough to get to do that 3 times during the event. I only got footage of 2 of them because my battery ran out, but in these 2 you can see both the electric trigger and the manual override work, as well as the loader eject the spent shell casing.
We've got one more to do.
One more, perfect.
Second round, please.
Hang on, honey, hang on. I'm just not. I was at something else moving with my feet. Put out.
Got another one? Got a glove full of diesel in there as well, for a bit of a flash. Fucking brilliant. Oh, cartridge came out as well, eh? Good. Awesome. Thank you, gents.
Thank you. The sound of the gunfire is actually fairly quiet inside the tank. In fact, the entire drive was fairly quiet, even while the tank was running and you could hear the tracks squeal and the turret traverse. It was never loud enough that we couldn't hear each other. Of course, if there's gunfire going on, the intercom would come very handy, but even when our gunfire is inside the tank, it's not that loud. There was actually some artillery firing while we were out in the field, so this will give you some idea of what gunfire inside a T-34-85 tank sounds like, as long as you don't get hit, of course. All right.
Twin touchdown. How'd you put the touchdown?
Yeah, you have to unlatch it.
How'd you do that?
And that's it. That was my experience being a part of a T-34-85 tank crew at the Capel Military Show. It was a definitely very interesting experience. As a military historian, I've read about pretty much every aspect of operating a tank, but naturally you get very few opportunities to do so in real life. The experience overall wasn't that bad. The tank wasn't crowded or that cramped. It was actually a bit cooler than outside since you weren't in direct sunlight. It was never so loud that we couldn't hear each other speak, although if you're in the turret of the tank and somebody's trying to yell at you through the driver's hatch, even when the tank isn't running, you need somebody to relay that message to you, because inside a tank, you really can't hear what's going on outside at all. Even when your own gun fires, all you hear is a little pop. I didn't find it to be particularly dangerous or difficult to operate inside the tank. There is not tons of room, but figure out how to move around without getting into each other's way. And like I said, at one point we even had 6 people inside the tank rather than the regimented 5. So the T-34-85 is not what I would call a luxurious experience, but there's definitely enough room for the crew to operate. I'll finish up the video with history of this specific tank. Much like the T-34-85 tank at the Ontario Regiment Museum that you may have seen during the Kino Tank Weekend, this particular vehicle was captured in Bosnia, and it had a pretty similar trip to get there. It was built at Factory 174 in Omsk in either late 1944 or early 1945. In fact, the stamp on the gun says 1945, so almost certainly it would have been built in February or January, since it still used the early type of cupola. The markings on this tank found underneath the paint when it was being restored, they marked the tank as belonging to the 3rd Guards Tank Army. Now, the 3rd Guards Tank Army was in Berlin, and so we have a feeling that this tank might have been in Berlin, simply because it takes about 3 or 4 months for a vehicle to come off the factory floor and then get to an actual unit that uses it. It definitely saw combat. On the back, you can see where there's a very large hole that was welded shut, and the engine bed and, of course, engine and transmission had to be rebuilt after it got hit by something really big in the back. After that, the tank remained in service. You could see that some of the wheels are post-war. There is, of course, the same set of modernizations that the T-34-85 at Aquino had, so a mount for an infrared spotlight. You can actually see some of the infrared equipment still left over on the inside. Some leftover boxes and bits and bobs, so that the Soviet Army would have added to the tank when it was being modernized. And the T-34-85 was modernized a lot after the war. This tank was then given to the Yugoslavs, and the Yugoslavs made their own modernizations to it. They brought it up to a standard called T-34B. And so the biggest changes that they introduced was their own radio in the turret, so the radio is still inside the turret. The Yugoslav radio is still in there. There's some electrical components that are Yugoslav. There's quite a lot of the electrics still have Russian markings on them. So this tank has been updated, but not fully gutted and refurbished. There's also a 50 caliber gun mount on the back for an American 50 cal. That's something the Yugoslavs quite liked, and we left it on the tank just since it's a part of the tank's history, even though it's not really accurate for the World War II era. Now, of course, when Yugoslavia fell apart, this tank was used in the Yugoslav Civil War, and you can actually see damage on the side of the tank from what we think is 50 caliber armor-piercing shot. And after being used by the Bosnians for a little bit, this tank fell to British peacekeepers, and that's how it ended up in the UK, just like the T-34-85 that's in Canada right now. This particular vehicle entered service in 1945 and then remained in use for the next 50 years, either during peacetime or as a combat vehicle. If tanks could talk, this one could definitely have a lot of stories to tell us, but unfortunately all we have to go on is the various design features, serial numbers, markings, and stamps. Hopefully next year I'll be able to return to Capel and have a turn at operating this storied and experienced fighting vehicle once again. But until that time, goodbye.
What? So just watch where you're walking.
It's where you get to here, but it all gets tricky. Exactly, yeah. Yeah. Right, so you get this far, and you're supposed to turn around. Keyword being supposed to. Oh, Christ.
Do you want to try again?
No. I've committed to the act now. Well, I did it, nearly.
You caught?
A little bit.